The mountain wind screamed through the pines like something dying as Sarah Bruce wiped down the last table of the Ridgeline Diner. Nearly 2 o'clock in the morning, and the storm had driven away even the truckers who usually stopped for coffee on their way through the pass. She should have been terrified, working alone this late. But fear was a luxury Sarah couldn't afford. Not when the tips from the graveyard shift paid for her grandmother's medicine. The lights flickered. Once, twice. Then she heard it. A sound so faint she almost missed it beneath the thunder. A thin, crystalline cry that didn't quite sound human. It rang like breaking glass, like wind chimes made of bones. Sarah froze, her hand still clutching the dish rag. The cry came again, sharper this time, more desperate, from somewhere behind the building. Every instinct screamed at her to lock the door and call the police. Mountain lions sometimes wandered down from the peaks. Or worse. The missing person reports had been piling up lately, bodies drained of blood, throats torn open, strange ice burns on the skin. The town called them animal attacks, but the way people whispered in the diner, the way they locked their doors before sunset, they knew better. The cry pierced the night again, fragile and utterly alone. Sarah grabbed the flashlight from under the counter and pushed through the back door. Rain lashed her face immediately, soaking through her thin uniform and tattered apron. She swept the beam across the alley, past the dumpster, toward the line of trash bins. There. A bundle of cloth wedged between two metal containers, shaking in the downpour. Sarah's heart hammered as she approached. Please don't be what I think it is. Please don't be. She pulled back the soaked fabric. A baby. No more than 3 months old, naked except for the tattered blanket wrapped loosely around its tiny body. But this was no ordinary infant. Its skin was frost-white, almost translucent in the flashlight's beam. Delicate blue veins traced patterns across its chest. And from the crown of its head grew sharp, translucent ice crystals, beautiful and horrifying, like a natural coronet of frozen glass. The crystals pulsed with a faint bluish glow, casting eerie light across the baby's scrunched, agonized face. Sarah gasped and stumbled backward. The baby's eyes squeezed tighter, its mouth opening in another cry. When its tiny fist clenched, frost spread across the wet concrete beneath it. Run, her mind screamed. Run now. But her body wouldn't obey. Because beneath the impossible features, beneath the supernatural horror of what she was seeing, there was only one truth that mattered. This was a child. Abandoned. Dying. The baby's skin felt like touching a block of ice when Sarah lifted it. Its chest barely moved with each breath. Those crystal formations on its head were growing, spreading down toward its temples like a disease, and the baby whimpered in obvious pain with each new formation. "Oh, sweetheart," Sarah whispered, wrapping the infant in her wool shawl, the one her grandmother had knitted, the only warm thing she owned. "What happened to you?" She carried the baby inside, kicking the door shut against the storm. The diner's warmth enveloped them both, but the child's temperature didn't change. Still cold. Still wrong. The ice crystals on its head actually seemed to intensify in the heat, growing sharper, more painful looking. Sarah tried milk first, warm to body temperature. The baby turned its head away, whimpering. She tried water, sugar water, even a bit of broth from the kitchen. Nothing. The infant grew weaker in her arms, its cries becoming softer, more desperate. The crystal crown spread further, and Sarah watched in horror as tiny frost patterns began creeping down the baby's neck. Sarah's hands shook as she rocked it, searching frantically through her phone for answers she knew she wouldn't find. What did vampire babies eat? Did they even exist? And what was happening to this child's head? Of course they exist, she thought grimly, staring at the proof in her arms. The question is, Why is one dying in my diner? The baby's eyes began to flutter closed. Its breathing grew shallow.
No, no, no.
Stay with me, little one. Please. Panic clawed at Sarah's throat. She was watching this child die, and there was nothing she could do. In desperation, she began to hum. It was an old melody, something her grandmother used to sing when Sarah was small and frightened. She didn't remember the words anymore, only the tune, sad and sweet and ancient, like it came from a time before electric lights and modern fears. The baby's eyes opened. Its tiny fist curled around Sarah's finger with surprising strength. The whimpering stopped, and Sarah nearly dropped the child in shock. The ice crystals on its head began to recede. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, they melted back toward the crown, leaving smooth, pale skin in their wake. Oh, thank God, Sarah breathed, tears streaming down her face. She kept humming, swaying gently, and the infant settled against her chest. Its breathing grew steadier, stronger. The bluish glow around the remaining crystals softened to something almost gentle, no longer spreading, no longer hurting. She looked down at the child's wrist and saw a mark she'd missed before. A symbol that looked like a crown merged with a crescent moon, deep crimson against the pale skin. It seemed to pulse with its own inner light. This wasn't just any vampire child. This was someone important, someone powerful, someone royal, and someone had tried to kill it. Sarah glanced at the diner's windows, suddenly aware of how exposed she was. The storm raged outside, turning the glass into sheets of flowing darkness. Anything could be out there. Anyone. Whoever had abandoned this baby might come back to finish the job. I won't let them, Sarah whispered to the sleeping infant. I don't know what you are or where you came from, but you're safe now. I promise. She locked every door and pulled the shades. Then she settled into the corner booth, the one where she could see both entrances, and held the baby close. The child felt slightly warmer now, its breathing deep and even. The ice crown had stopped growing entirely, resting dormant and beautiful against its small head. Sarah kept humming through the night, watching the darkness beyond the windows, waiting for dawn. She didn't know that 5 miles away in a dying Gothic castle, a vampire king was tearing apart what remained of his kingdom, searching for his missing son. She didn't know that the lullaby she hummed was a royal melody sung only by the vampire queens of old, the only sound that could soothe a disabled prince whose body couldn't regulate the ancient ice magic in his blood. And she didn't know that by saving this child, she had just rewritten the fate of 2 species. The storm raged on. In Sarah's arms, the baby vampire, Prince Orion, slept peacefully for the first time in 3 days. Outside, something ancient and powerful caught the scent of the royal bloodline on the wind and turned toward the Ridgeline Diner. The storm hadn't stopped when Sarah finally saw headlights cut through the rain-streaked windows. It was nearly 7 o'clock in the evening. She'd stayed at the diner all day, afraid to take the baby outside, afraid to let it out of her sight. The few customers who'd wandered and had been easy to avoid, she'd kept the infant hidden in the back office, wrapped in her shawl, humming softly whenever it stirred. Now the dinner rush should have started, but the storm had kept everyone away. Until him. The man who entered the diner moved like winter itself given form. His elaborate black Gothic coat dripped rainwater onto the worn linoleum, and when he pushed back his hood, Sarah's breath caught in her throat. He was beautiful in a way that hurt to look at. Sharp, angular features, corpse-white skin, long platinum blonde hair that fell past his shoulders, straight as falling snow. 2 deep, stitched scars cut across his left cheek, telling stories of violence survived. But his eyes were what made her grip the counter's edge. They were icy blue, glowing with inhuman light, scanning the empty diner with predatory focus. "We're open," Sarah managed, her voice barely steady. "Take any seat." The stranger didn't move. He stood in the doorway, rain hammering the roof above him, his gaze locked on Sarah with an intensity that made her skin prickle with cold. "You're alone," he said. It wasn't a question. His voice was deep, ancient, carrying the weight of centuries in two simple words. A faint accent she couldn't place colored each syllable. "My cook called in sick. Storm's keeping folks home." Sarah forced herself to move, to act normal, to pretend her heart wasn't racing. "What can I get you?" "I'm looking for something." He stepped inside, and Sarah noticed he cast no reflection in the chrome napkin dispenser on the counter. "Someone, actually. Have you seen anything unusual? Perhaps a child?" Sarah's blood turned to ice. "He knows. Oh God, he knows." "Just me and the storm," she said, reaching for a menu with trembling hands. "Coffee? We've got fresh pie." Thunder cracked overhead, and from the back office came a sound that shattered the lie. A baby's cry, crystalline, fragile, unmistakable. The stranger's entire body went rigid. His eyes blazed brighter, shifting from ice blue to something closer to white fire. In one fluid movement, he crossed the diner, impossibly fast, his hand slamming against the office door before Sarah could even scream. "No, please." But he was already inside. Sarah ran after him, terror giving her speed, and found him standing frozen in the doorway. Just standing there, staring. At the baby wrapped in her grandmother's shawl. At the small ice crown glowing softly in the dim light. At the tiny hand reaching toward nothing, searching for comfort. The Vampire King's expression shattered. Shock.
Fear.
Recognition. Relief so profound it looked like pain. "Orion," he breathed, and the single word carried the weight of 3 days of desperate searching, of kingdoms torn apart, of hope nearly lost. He moved toward the baby, and Sarah's body reacted before her mind could catch up. She threw herself between them, arms spread wide, protecting the infant behind her. "Don't you touch him." Her voice shook. Her legs shook. Everything about this was suicide, standing between an ancient vampire and what he wanted. But she couldn't stop herself. The king's glowing eyes lifted to meet hers. For a long moment, he simply stared at her. At this fragile, exhausted human in a tattered apron and dirt-smudged face, daring to defy him. Then something impossible happened. His expression softened. Just slightly. Just enough. "You protected him," Vlad Wilson whispered, his voice rough with emotion he hadn't felt in centuries. "You saved my son." And in that moment, everything the Vampire King believed about humans, about weakness, about worthlessness, about the insurmountable divide between their species, began to crack like ice under the first warmth of spring. Before we dive deeper into the story, take a moment to hit that like button if you love suspenseful, emotional stories that keep you on the edge of your seat. Make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next thrilling chapter. We also want to hear from you. Drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Whether it's your city, your country, or even just your favorite spot to watch these stories, we love connecting with our global audience. Now let's get back to the story and see just how far courage can take someone when danger is closing in. Sarah sat huddled on the floor of the cafe's back office, the howling storm a distant threat compared to the cold horror she held in her arms. The pale infant, Orion, had an unearthly stillness, his skin a deathly frost white. The most alarming feature, his crown-like formation of sharp, translucent ice crystals, seemed to be intensifying. The fine, shimmering particles of frost clinging to his body grew thicker, making him colder with every passing hour. He refused the milk Sarah had carefully warmed. Anything that hinted at human sustenance was immediately rejected, and his tiny face would scrunch up in pain. His silence was punctuated only by weak, shallow gasps. He was fading. Panic began to claw at Sarah's exhausted mind. She was a waitress, not a nurse, and certainly not equipped to save a disabled, supernatural baby who seemed to be freezing from the inside out. Grief and fear blurred her vision. Her hands, rough from cleaning tables, trembled around the precious, fragile life. She needed to do something, anything, to stop the inevitable. Suddenly, without thinking, she began to hum. It was an old tune, a protective lullaby her grandmother used to sing, its melody more ancient than any song Sarah had ever heard. She had learned it as a child, an unconscious melody passed down through generations of human fear and hope. As the quiet, trembling notes filled the tiny office, a remarkable change occurred. The relentless, high-pitched crying stopped. Orion's icy eyes, previously squeezed shut in discomfort, relaxed. The faint bluish glow around the ice crystals on his head began to soften, taking on a gentle, almost warm light. He stopped shivering, and his tiny hand, colder than granite, uncurled and gripped her stained apron, his grip surprisingly firm. He was listening, finding comfort in the only sound that reached him. The lullaby had found a connection where blood could not. While Sarah, relieved but utterly shaken, continued the fragile tune, hundreds of miles away, in a dying Gothic castle carved from black stone, King Vlad Wilson was tearing his court apart. The vampire king, platinum-haired and scarred, was a creature of cold, elegant fury. His piercing, icy blue eyes scanned the terrified faces of his advisors. "My son is gone." Vlad's voice was a low, terrifying rumble that echoed off the high, dark arches of the throne room. Heir to the oldest bloodline, and he has vanished without a trace. His desperation was a palpable force. Orion was his only link to the future, the fragile proof that his queen's sacrifice had not been in vain. His castle, his kingdom, and his own cold, ancient life depended on that single infant. He suspected betrayal, rebellion, and a plot to destroy his line. "Find him," Vlad commanded, his voice sharp with finality. "And bring the one who took him, be they mortal or immortal. I will have them both." The search for the crystal-crowned prince intensified, and the king, unaware that his son was safe in the embrace of a mortal waitress, launched his terrifying, unstoppable hunt. The storm outside the Pine Ridge Cafe was not just rain and wind. It was a physical manifestation of the terror that had settled over the mountain town. Sarah stayed hidden, pressing her back against the file cabinet in the cramped, cluttered office, the weight of the tiny, ice-crowned infant, Orion, a leaden comfort in her arms. She tried to ignore the sporadic, frantic reports crackling faintly on the police scanner mounted near the counter, mentions of an unprecedented, massive search operation in the high peaks, strange lights, and missing military teams. They were searching for him, she knew. They were searching for this impossible, cold-born prince she had foolishly saved. She stayed put, relying on the storm and the late hour to keep the world away. The bell above the cafe door didn't chime. There was no rattle of the handle, no sound of a car crunching gravel outside. There was only the sudden, absolute cessation of the wind against the glass, a silence so profound it felt like a pressure against her eardrums. Sarah lifted her head, every muscle tensing. He appeared not as a man entering a room, but as a shadow condensing into form. King Vlad Wilson. He was impossibly tall, his elegant, Gothic coat shimmering with dark thread, and his platinum blonde hair falling like liquid moonlight around features that were sculpted, sharp, and terrifying. The scars stitched across his cheek added a line of severe, aristocratic cruelty to his expression. His eyes, an inhuman, icy blue, cut through the gloom of the cafe, passing over the empty tables and focusing instantly on the thin slice of light escaping the office doorway. Vlad moved without sound, without casting a reflection, crossing the distance in a breath. He paused at the doorway, blocking the last thread of safety Sarah had imagined. "You," the king stated, his voice a low, cultivated baritone that held the sound of centuries. It wasn't a question, but a sentence. "Where is my son?" Sarah's breath hitched, caught like a trapped bird in her chest. She stood slowly, using the desk as a shield, the exhaustion wiped clean by pure, lethal adrenaline. Her worn, tattered waitress blouse and stained apron were a pathetic defense against the embroidered Gothic armor of the king.
I
don't know what you're talking about," Sarah whispered, her voice cracking. "I was cleaning up. I haven't seen anyone." Vlad took a measured step toward her, and the air around him seemed to drop 10 degrees. "Do not waste my time, little mortal," he warned, his cold eyes fixed on the bundle she clutched. "I tracked his scent here, faint as it is. It clings to you, to the fibers of your ridiculous shawl." The pressure of his presence was overwhelming, crushing her with the weight of his power. Orion, sensing the extreme danger and the terror radiating off Sarah, began to cry, a thin, desperate, rasping sound that was more of a plea than a wail. Hearing his son, Vlad's terrifying facade cracked. His icy blue gaze snapped from Sarah's face to the bundle, and the shock that crossed his features was profound. He saw the shimmering, translucent crystals of the crown, the deathly white skin. Recognition, fear, and a terrifying, desperate love warred in his aristocratic face. Before Vlad could move, before he could even utter a command, Sarah threw herself forward, turning her back to the desk and presenting her fragile body as the only barrier. She pressed the disabled infant deep into her shoulder. She was exhausted, fragile, and utterly outmatched, yet her will was absolute. "You won't touch him," she said, her voice shaking but hard. "He's sick. You abandoned him. You don't get to hurt him again." King Vlad Wilson's terrifying presence froze Sarah to the spot, her body a fragile barrier shielding the source of his desperation. He had seen the shimmering, ice-white skin and the crown of translucent crystals, the undeniable, heartbreaking signs of his son, Prince Orion. The sudden crack in Vlad's elegant composure was profound. The stitched scars on his cheeks seemed to deepen as recognition, relief, and rage fought across his aristocratic features. Ignoring Sarah's pathetic defiance, Vlad moved with the speed of an ancient predator, sidestepping the desk and arriving at the barrier of her body. He reached out a hand, pale and large, the cuff of his elaborate coat brushing her worn shoulder. It was a gesture of ownership, of an absolute royal right to reclaim what was his. "Give him to me, mortal," he commanded, his voice shaking with centuries of restrained power. "You have played your foolish game. Now step aside." Sarah did not move, but before Vlad's fingers could brush the shawl, Orion let out a cry that was not weak or desperate, but violently reactive. The infant arched backward, away from his father's touch, his tiny face contorted in a silent scream of rejection. His ethereal blue glow flared, pushing a palpable wave of cold energy back at the king. Vlad stumbled back a single, stunned step. The vampire king, feared across the kingdoms, had been physically repelled by his own heir. Humiliation was a bitter taste in his mouth, but it was eclipsed by sheer, agonizing confusion. He saw the cold, Sharp crystals of Orion's crown begin to pulse in time with the baby's distress. Orion, Vlad whispered, using his son's name for the first time, his icy blue eyes fixed on the repulsive sight of his heir rejecting the power of his own blood. The baby continued to wail, his small hands flailing in fear, until one hand snagged Sarah's tattered apron, clutching the fabric as if it were an anchor in a raging sea. Instantly, the intensity of the crying dropped. The cold light around the crystals softened. Orion was not reaching for his father, but clinging to the exhausted human who smelled of coffee and mortal weakness. Vlad was paralyzed, his mind reeling. The king's absolute rule demanded he take the child by force, but the fragility of his disabled son and the clear violence of his rejection made the move impossible. He had spent 3 days fighting ancient magic and court betrayal, only to be stopped by a human waitress and his son's inexplicable preference. He lifted his gaze to Sarah, his features hardening into a mask of cruel, forced control. "Hold him," he ordered, his voice suddenly quiet, yet weighted with lethal authority. Sarah, terrified but sensing a flicker of necessity in his inhuman eyes, obeyed instantly. She adjusted the baby, pulling Orion close to the warmth of her chest. The infant sighed, a sound of perfect contentment, and pressed his head into the exhausted curve of her neck. The cold, tense lines of Orion's face smoothed out as his grip tightened on her blouse. The undeniable truth was laid bare in the cramped office. The all-powerful vampire king could not soothe his heir, but the powerless, frail waitress could. Vlad watched the scene with a mixture of terror and aristocratic disgust. The stitched scars on his cheek seemed to glow in the dim light. His mouth twisted in a sneer of pure conflict as he took in the sight, the pristine perfection of his ancient bloodline finding comfort in the dirt-smudged, fragile form of a mortal. "Explain this anomaly," Vlad demanded, his voice dropping to a dangerous level. He leaned in, forcing Sarah to meet his terrifying gaze. "Tell me, Sarah Bruce, why does my heir, the future of the Wilson dynasty, choose the scent of a mortal over the blood of his king?" He wasn't asking for an alibi. He was asking for the meaning of a phenomenon that threatened to tear down the very foundation of his long, cold existence. King Vlad Wilson's terrifying gaze pinned Sarah to the spot, the question hanging heavy in the small, cluttered office. "Explain this anomaly, Sarah Bruce. Why does my heir, the future of the Wilson dynasty, choose the scent of a mortal over the blood of his king?" The final word was a low, dangerous command, and the icy blue light in his eyes seemed to gather, challenging her very existence, threatening to extinguish the dim lamplight around them. Sarah, though internally shaking with a violent tremor she fought to suppress, clung to the deep-seated exhaustion that had become her only shield. She was too tired for theatrics, too focused on the peaceful, fragile weight of Orion in her arms. She looked past the platinum hair and the severe stitched scars cutting across Vlad's cheek, seeking the desperate, heartbroken father hidden behind the royal monster's mask. I don't know what bloodline is," she whispered, her voice husky and brittle from fear and fatigue. The words were a plea, not a defense. But he was cold. He was abandoned. He had those crystals, and he only stopped crying when I sang him a song. Vlad recoiled as if struck by a tangible force. The sound of his sharply indrawn breath was the only noise louder than the drumming rain outside. "A song," he repeated, the concept utterly foreign to the ancient, blood-soaked traditions of his court. "It's an old one. My grandmother taught it to me," Sarah explained quickly, holding Orion closer to her worn, faded apron. Her damp, tangled hair fell across her face, obscuring the sight of the terrifying king. "A protective song. A lullaby, maybe." It's the only thing that worked. He's been through something awful, my lord. He's frail. He needs comfort, not power. She spoke the simple, undeniable truth, and that raw, exhausted honesty was her only weapon against his immense power. She refused to lie, because lying would mean denying Orion the only thing that had saved him thus far. Vlad watched her, his expression a tight, terrible mask of shock giving way to calculation. He took in the dirt smudges on her cheek, the vulnerability radiating from her small form, and the fiercely protective way she held his air. This was no rebel operative. She lacked the cunning and the malice. She was simply a waitress who had refused to let a baby die. He knew his own court's cruelty. They were capable of abandoning a disabled prince, viewing the crystal crown as a curse or a flaw. Sarah's complete innocence ironically lent credence to her unbelievable story. The king's icy blue eyes darted from Sarah's grief-stricken face to Orion, resting briefly on the infant's serene expression. The baby, with his magnificent, cursed crown, was undeniably quiet, drawing life and warmth from this human's embrace. Yet, the vampire king's mind was built on ancient suspicion. If he let her go, she would be hunted down by his enemies, the rebels who sought to dethrone him, and more dangerously, by the traitors within his own castle. The hunt for Sarah would expose Orion's location immediately. If he killed her, the ice-crowned prince might succumb to loneliness or lack of comfort, dying in his own father's arms. The choice was agonizing, a necessity forced upon him by a pathetic mortal. He was tied to her by the life of his son. Vlad moved, stepping back with a soundless grace, running a hand through his long, pale hair. The aristocratic coat moved with a lethal rustle, the silver accents flashing under the dim light. The rebels know he is gone. My own court is poisoned with ambition and bigotry. They will look here. And you, mortal, are now a liability to his survival, an insult to their ancient code. His voice dropped to a sound that scraped against the stone, dripping with cold resignation. I cannot risk losing him again. And I cannot risk destroying the source of his calm. He made the definitive shift, his choice solidified by the realization that if he left her, he was signing Orion's death warrant. I require your subservience. Your life now serves the crown. He leaned in one final time, the stitched scars on his cheek prominent, his breath unnaturally cold against her skin. You are coming with me, Sarah Bruce. Vlad's hand clamped around her wrist, not gently, but with immense, controlled strength, a promise of absolute domination. There is no choice. Your life is forfeit otherwise. You are now the property of the crown, and the only path to your survival is to ensure the survival of Prince Orion. He didn't wait for her consent. He pulled her up. The world dissolved into a blur of motion. Vlad moved with the speed of compressed shadow, blurring the borders of the cafe's back alley. Sarah gasped, clutching Orion tighter, the wind whipping her messy hair around her face. They were high in the mountains now, the air thin and sharp, carrying the scent of pine and ancient stone. The king came to a sudden, silent halt before a structure that was neither castle nor cave, but something in between. A secluded, highly warded lodge. It was built into the side of a sheer cliff, its stone walls covered in arcane markings and symbols that pulsed faintly with dark, protective energy. The air around the lodge felt heavy, pressurized, warding off both mortal and immortal intruders. Vlad shoved open the heavy oak door. The interior was sparse, cold, but secure, a military safe house. He dropped her arm, and the silence of the lodge instantly replaced the cacophony of the storm. Do not leave this room, Vlad commanded, his voice now devoid of rage, possessing only the finality of stone. Do not speak to the guards, and do not attempt escape. You are safe from the storm, and for the moment, you are safe from my court. But your life is now entirely dependent on the heartbeat, or lack thereof, of my son." He looked at the tiny crystal crown on Orion's head one last time, his icy eyes holding a flicker of pain and a dawning, terrifying realization. He had taken a human to save his vampire heir, forever tainting the purity he had sworn to uphold. The necessity of his son's survival had forced the king of vampires to break his most sacred principle. With a final, terrifying look that promised death if she failed, King Vlad Wilson turned and vanished into the shadows, leaving Sarah alone in the cold silence of the warded lodge, an exhausted protector under the roof of her greatest enemy, holding the disabled prince whose life was the only thing standing between her and total destruction. The warded lodge was a pocket of cold, intimidating silence, high up in the treacherous passes of the Carpathian Mountains. To Sarah Bruce, it felt less like a safe house and more like a tomb. King Vlad had vanished as quickly as he arrived, leaving her with the daunting task of caring for Prince Orion in a foreign, cold, and utterly dangerous environment. She knew her life was a temporary tether, serving only the necessity of the king's heir. The security of the lodge was absolute: heavy, warded stone and a handful of ancient, emotionless vampire guards posted outside, but the true threat, she instinctively knew, lay not in the rebels outside, but in the prejudice waiting at the heart of the kingdom. King Vlad Wilson materialized in the grand throne room of his dying Gothic castle, the silence there even heavier than the quiet of the lodge. His entrance was a rush of freezing air, and the court nobles, assembled for the urgent council, visibly tensed. They saw a ruler stretched taut between vengeance and duty, his pale features sharpened by the ordeal of losing and then locating his son. But they also sensed a profound, dangerous shift, the scent of mortal presence clinging to their king. The council was a rigid display of ancient power and barely contained outrage. The most vocal and influential members were Commander Varric, a warrior whose loyalty to the purity of the bloodline bordered on fanaticism, and Lady Selene, an ice-cold aristocrat who had openly coveted the position of queen. They represented the unyielding core of the Wilson dynasty, clinging to the isolation and ritual that kept them safe from the sun and, critically, safe from human weakness. "The prince is safe," Vlad stated, his voice devoid of warmth, echoing against the stone arches. "He has been recovered from the outlying districts. He is currently secured at the Cliffside Lodge." A murmur rippled through the hall, but Commander Varric stepped forward immediately, his posture accusing. "Safe, Your Majesty? From whom? And who, dare I ask, is attending him? Our physicians were dispatched the moment he was reported missing. Surely the Crown Prince is not being handled by those peasants who took him." Vlad's icy blue eyes narrowed. He was not taken. He was abandoned and found by a human woman named Sarah Bruce. She is currently acting as his cradle-bearer. His survival depends upon her presence. The ensuing reaction was volcanic. Lady Selene let out a sound of sheer disgust, covering her mouth with a hand that glittered with ancient rings. "A human? Vlad, you mock us. The heir to the first king is being nursed by mortal filth? It is an insult to the queen's memory and a disease upon his blood. She is a spy, a witch, or a rebel operative, trying to infect the purity of his spirit." Varric was the most dangerous. His tone was low, steady, and infused with self-righteous fury. "With respect, sire, your judgment is clouded by desperation. The prince possesses the crystal flaw, a sign of his vulnerability. Introducing a mortal, who harbors the sun's very essence, to his immediate vicinity is not merely a risk, it is treason. We cannot allow this foreign influence to corrupt the future of our line." She must be purged immediately. Vlad slammed his fist onto the arm of the throne, the heavy, ancient wood groaning in protest. Silence. You forget who rules here. She is necessary. He responds to her touch, to her song. Until he can be weaned from her comfort, she is under my absolute protection. No one touches her. No one approaches the cliffside lodge without my express, written decree. I will not lose my son because of your archaic bigotry. He dismissed the court with a final, chilling threat, but the damage was done. The seed of rebellion had been planted, fertilized by pride and the desire for power. To Varric and Celine, the king was compromised, weakened by paternal affection and blinded by a human trick. They saw only one path to restore the kingdom's strength: eliminate the human threat, destroy the weakness, and force the king back onto his solitary, cruel throne. They believed they were acting for the greater good of the bloodline. Hours later, as twilight deepened into the absolute blackness that favored the vampires, Commander Varric, flanked by a small, loyal cohort of elite guards, approached the cliffside lodge. He did not rely on brute force. He relied on betrayal. One of the ancient guards posted outside, a veteran vampire named Kale, had served Varric for centuries. A swift, silent signal passed between them, a subtle hand gesture, an almost imperceptible nod. Kale had been bribed with promises of higher rank and the restoration of the true king's strength. He had been swayed by the argument that the human was a plague. Kale, without alerting the other guards, silently deactivated the arcane sigil wards woven into the lodge's back entrance, opening a critical flaw in the king's defenses. He then stepped aside as Varric and his men, moving with ruthless purpose, slipped through the breached barrier. The pressurized, heavy air of the warded house felt instantly thin, corrupted by the incoming malice. Varric led the infiltration, his focus cold and sharp. The king is misguided. We restore his honor and the purity of Prince Orion. The human must die. Silent and swift. No struggle. Inside, Sarah was finally resting, exhausted but vigilant, lying on a rough cot with Orion nestled safely against her. The baby was sleeping soundly, the gentle blue glow of his ice crown a constant comfort. The only sound was the soft, rhythmic hum of the lullaby that Sarah was still unconsciously whispering. It was the last moment of peace before the betrayal, and the resulting clash between ancient hatred and a mother's fierce, desperate love. The attack had begun. The sudden, invasive silence was the first thing that woke Sarah Bruce. The heavy, pressurized air of the warded lodge, a constant, humming reassurance of protection, had gone flat, replaced by the chilling, ordinary cold of the mountain stone. She sprang from the rough cot, instinct overriding exhaustion, her heart slamming against her ribs. Prince Orion awoke too, whimpering softly, his crystal crown emitting a faint, anxious blue pulse. Before Sarah could process the danger, the outer door of the safe room exploded inward. Shards of cold oak scattered across the stone floor, followed by the terrifying sight of Commander Varric and his 3 elite guards. Varric was a vision of ruthless purpose, his platinum hair drawn back, his eyes burning with fanaticism. He wasn't here to capture. He was here to purge. The king is sentimental, the fool, Varric hissed, his voice echoing with absolute authority. But the bloodline is not. You, human, are a plague upon the Wilson house. Sarah didn't scream. She didn't beg. Her exhausted, frail appearance vanished, replaced by a fierce, desperate animalistic defense. She shoved Orion deep into the corner behind the cot, covering him completely with her body. The vampire guards moved with impossible speed, a blur of elegant black coats and lethal intent. But Sarah was faster than she looked, fueled by a love born of necessity. She scrambled, grabbing the only weapon she could, a heavy, iron candle holder from a makeshift table. The first guard, a towering vampire named Caius, reached for her. Sarah swung the iron with a clumsy, human desperation, connecting with his arm. It did nothing to him, but it bought her a precious second. Caius, annoyed, backhanded her. The blow sent her flying, slamming her hard against the cold stone wall. The air was knocked from her lungs, and a hot, sickening pain bloomed in her shoulder. She collapsed, choking on the pain. Varric ignored her, his focus purely on the infant. "Take the child. We cleanse the chamber later." As a second guard lunged for the cot, Sarah lunged with equal ferocity. She didn't have strength, but she had rage. She tackled the vampire's knees, bringing him down in a surprising, heavy clatter. She scrambled onto his back, sinking her fingers into his heavy coat. He threw her off like a rag doll, sending her tumbling over the broken furniture. She landed on a shard of the shattered oak door, which tore a long, agonizing gash through her worn apron and into her side. Blood, warm, red, human blood, spilled onto the gray stone floor, steaming faintly in the cold vampire air. Her energy was gone. She tried to rise, but her limbs refused to obey. She was just a tired woman with a knife wound and a shattered shoulder, facing 4 ancient, powerful killers. She could only watch in paralyzing terror as Commander Varric, stepping over the fallen furniture with aristocratic disdain, strode toward the corner where Orion lay hidden. "Such a pretty flaw," Varric muttered, looking down at the infant. "A crystal crown, a disability of ice. But we cannot risk the king's weakness corrupting you further. Farewell, Prince." He raised his hand, his intention clear. A sound tore from Sarah's throat, not a word, but a primal, desperate shriek of pure maternal horror. It was the last sound she had left. With a final, impossible effort, she dragged herself across the stone, trailing a smear of her own blood. She didn't make it in time to shield him, but she extended her hand, her blood-soaked fingers stretching desperately towards Orion. Varric laughed, a dry, cruel sound. A final touch? How pathetic. He was about to strike the infant when Sarah's hand collapsed onto the floor, her life fading, her warm, human blood pooling near the baby's face. The moment the blood touched the cold, crystalline edges of Orion's swaddling cloth, the air fractured. The faint blue pulse from the crystal crown exploded into a blinding, white-hot nova. The light was not gentle. It was searing, painful, and raw with ancient, defensive power. The infant, still wrapped in Sarah's shawl, was suddenly encased in a dome of shimmering, impenetrable energy. It was a barrier of pure, protective force, pulsing violently with the strength of the ancient life it protected. The resulting shockwave was deafening. Varric and his guards, creatures of darkness and cold, were thrown violently backward, screaming as the light scorched their eyes and the barrier's raw power slammed into their bodies. They hit the distant wall with bone-jarring force, the ancient stone cracking under the impact. Sarah, lying broken and half-conscious on the floor, watched the impossible sight. Her vision swam, the spreading red stain around her turning black at the edges, but she saw Orion, safe, protected, bathed in an energy that was clearly triggered by her sacrifice. The barrier, immense and undeniable, was radiating outward from her last, bleeding point of contact. Varric, recovering quickly despite being stunned, rose to his knees, his face contorted with shock and fury. "What impossible magic is this? The king lied. This isn't just a woman. She's a witch." But before Varric could gather his strength for another attack, the air in the lodge dropped to an unnatural, absolute zero. The stone walls groaned, and the protective barrier around Orion pulsed in recognition of something infinitely more powerful. A shadow, cold, vast, and steeped in ancient terror, materialized instantly between the traitors and the infant prince. King Vlad Wilson was back, drawn by the catastrophic failure of his wards and the blinding flash of his son's power. His platinum hair seemed to whip in an invisible wind, and his icy blue eyes were no longer merely cold. They were blazing with a cold, devastating fury. He saw the shattered room, the traitorous guards, the unconscious, broken form of Sarah Bruce trailing blood across the floor, and the unyielding, sacrificial light protecting his son. The necessity that had defined his rule for centuries was instantly replaced by a rage so profound, it threatened to unmake the very foundations of the lodge. The final showdown had begun. The air that had dropped to an absolute zero when King Vlad Wilson arrived was not merely cold, it was the chilling vacuum of death. It instantly snuffed out the lingering smoke from the shattered oak door and froze the blood spilled on the stone floor. Time fractured. Vlad stood where Shadow should have been, his long, platinum hair whipping around him as if caught in a vortex of pure wrath. His icy blue eyes, usually a detached, piercing light, were now twin stars of incandescent, terrifying fury, fixed entirely on the tableau before him. The shattered room, the scrambling, treacherous guards, and the sight of Sarah Bruce, broken, lifeless, her human blood staining the stone right up to the very edge of the blinding, white-hot energy barrier that encased his son, Prince Orion. Vlad didn't move, yet he was everywhere. His realization was instant and devastating. They had not only defied his direct order, but had harmed the one mortal on Earth his son acknowledged, the one who held the key to the Wilson bloodline's future. The king's customary aristocratic elegance evaporated, replaced by the raw, ancient terror of a creature who had ruled through millennia of cold slaughter. Traitors. The word was not spoken. It was a concussion of sound, a resonant wave of power that hit Commander Varric and his remaining guards like a physical hammer. Varric, stunned but rising, tried to stammer a defense. "My king, she is a witch. A mortal corruption. We were saving." Vlad did not wait for the lie to finish. His response was brutal, definitive, and terrifyingly swift. He moved not as a man, but as a black, elegant blur, a living shadow infused with silver lightning. He was a creature unbound. One moment, Varric was standing, his face a mask of defiant fanaticism. The next, Vlad's hand was sunk deep into the commander's chest, his heart ripped out and dissolved into ash before it even hit the floor. The remaining two guards, scrambling for weapons, were similarly consumed. One dissolved into a screaming cloud of vapor under the king's crushing psychic weight. The other was hurled through the thick stone wall with such force that the ancient structure groaned in protest, leaving behind only a smear of shadow and a gaping hole to the wind. It was not a battle. It was an execution of power so absolute that the lodge trembled, recognizing its master's unbound rage. In less than 3 heartbeats, the traitors were gone, reduced to dust and silence. The only sounds left were the howling wind and the panicked whimper of Prince Orion from inside his protective light. Vlad turned from the destruction, his terrifying power draining away, leaving behind a grief-stricken father. He walked to the center of the room, ignoring the ash and the splintered oak, his attention consumed by the shimmering dome around his son. He reached out a hand, platinum hair falling across his face, and his powerful fingers met the solid resistance of Orion's magic. The barrier rejected him, pulsing brighter, responding only to the ambient energy of the collapsed human. He looked at Sarah. She lay still, her chest barely rising, her fragile body utterly broken, a dark red pool steaming around the long, jagged gash in her side. It was her blood, her last act of sacrifice, that had triggered the primal, protective light. The power surge was anchored to her fading life force. "Orion," Vlad whispered, his regal voice cracking with desperation. He pressed his palm to the barrier. "My son. It's father. Let me in." The dome pulsed defiantly. The prince was safe, but he was isolated, trapped in his own defense mechanism, rejecting the one who had abandoned him, even if only for a short time. Vlad realized the horrific truth. Orion only felt safe in the presence of the warm, protective light of the mortal. With a sound that was half a sob and half a curse, the ancient king lowered himself to his knees amid the debris and the ash. The elegant coat pulled around him. He leaned his cold head against the impervious barrier, staring at the unconscious face of Sarah Bruce, and did the one thing he swore he never would. He closed his eyes and began to sing. It was the same song Sarah had hummed in the cafe, the protective, ancient lullaby of his lost queen. The cold, aristocratic notes were raw with centuries of pain and regret, sung for the first time by the king who had silenced his own heart. As the king's true, vulnerable sorrow infused the melody, the impossible happened. The furious, white-hot light of the barrier began to flicker, recognizing the source of the tune. The energy dome around Orion softened, the fierce power slowly draining away until it gently dissolved into tiny, shining motes of frost that settled over the infant like protective dust. Vlad didn't wait. He scrambled forward and gently lifted his son, holding the baby close. Then he turned his complete attention to Sarah. Her breathing was shallow, ragged, her life swiftly draining away. The bone in her shoulder was certainly shattered, and the wound in her side was deep. She was dying. To lose her now, after she had proved her purity with the most profound act of human sacrifice, would be to lose Orion forever, locking the boy away in an emotional prison Vlad could never reach. He made the final, irreversible choice, shattering the last sacred oath of his bloodline. Vlad quickly checked the door, ensuring the wards had re-established themselves. He pulled Sarah to him, cradling her head in his palm. He needed to heal her, not just physically, but fundamentally. There was only one way. He tilted his head, his sharp fangs extending, and drove them into his own wrist. Ancient, dark, concentrated vampire blood, power itself, flowed into the tear in his flesh. He brought his wrist to Sarah's lips. The taste was overwhelmingly metallic and sweet, flooding Sarah's fading senses. A shock wave of pure energy slammed into her, burning away the pain. She felt the iron candle holder's impact rewind from her shoulder, the shattered bone knitting itself together in a searing rush of heat. The raw gash in her side sealed instantly, leaving behind skin as smooth and pale as marble. The king's life force, his immense power, was rewriting her very mortality, pulling her back from the precipice of death and marking her as a creature of the night. Vlad watched, his own reserves draining, his face pale with exertion. He only stopped when the sickly pallor left her cheeks and a faint, steady heartbeat, a new, impossibly strong, cold heartbeat, returned. He had saved her. He had also damned her to his world, bound her to his son, and marked her with the essence of his ancient power. The king had not just healed the waitress, he had transformed the protector into a vessel of his own immortality. He lifted his wrist away, the two tiny puncture marks on her neck already fading into two silver crescents, the mark of the king. He was trembling, but the furious, devastating rage was gone, replaced by a profound, exhausted acceptance. He had sacrificed the purity of his past for the fragile hope of his future. Cradling his son in one arm and the newly changed Sarah in the other, King Vlad Wilson finally left the ruins of the lodge, carrying his family back to the dying heart of his Gothic castle. Sarah Bruce awoke not to the rattling cough of her grandmother or the familiar chill of the damp cafe office, but to profound, absolute cold. The sensation was not unpleasant. It was clean, like being wrapped in silk woven from moonlight. She lay nestled in a bed of heavy, dark velvet within a chamber carved from the mountain's heart, a lavish Gothic room where shadows danced in defiance of the weak light filtering through narrow, stained-glass windows. She lifted a hand, expecting pain, but found only an impossible strength. Her skin was unnaturally pale, nearly translucent, and when she pressed her fingers to her throat, she felt a powerful, steady thump, a heartbeat that was new, impossibly strong, and fundamentally cold, a sentinel pulse guarding an unexpected immortality. She was healed, whole, and utterly changed. The king's ancient blood had not only saved her, but had rewritten her very essence. She sat up, her messy hair clinging to her shoulders, the scent of dust and fear replaced by a strange, metallic perfume that hung in the air. The faint, telltale silver crescent marks on her neck, the signature of King Vlad's bite, had already faded into the pallor of her new skin. The silence broke as the door, vast and black, opened. King Vlad Wilson entered, looking as cold and elegantly terrifying as the night he had found her, though the lines around his piercing blue eyes spoke of exhaustion. He carried Prince Orion, wrapped in a dark velvet swaddling cloth, the infant's crystal crown glowing softly. "You live, mortal," Vlad stated, his voice flat, yet lacking its usual lethal edge. He set Orion gently down in a nearby cradle woven with dark wood. "My blood mended what my court shattered. You're no longer fully human. You belong to the night now." He watched her carefully, gauging her reaction. Sarah pushed herself off the bed, her feet silent on the polished stone floor. "My grandmother," she managed, her voice deeper, steadier than before. "She is safe," Vlad confirmed, cutting her off. "Relocated and cared for under my direct decree. The expenses will never concern you again. That promise is kept." He stepped closer, his intense gaze falling to the spot where her wound had been. "Now, we have a kingdom to govern and a court to correct." He paused, allowing the weight of the court's betrayal to settle between them. "The traitors who attacked the lodge are ash, but the sentiment that led them remains. They fear your humanity, and they fear my son's affliction. They will judge us both." Vlad retrieved Orion, settling the infant securely in the crook of his arm. He offered Sarah a cold, decisive look. "You are the proof of their treason and the key to our future. You will stand with me now. You will be introduced to the court not as a captive, but as the solution." The journey through the king's castle was a disorienting blend of terror and Gothic splendor. They moved through vast, vaulted halls adorned with centuries of dark velvet, cold silver, and statuary frozen mid-screen. Every shadow seemed to hold a pair of watchful, hostile eyes. They finally reached the main throne room, a chamber of impossible size and suffocating atmosphere, where dozens of vampires, the entire ancient court, were assembled. They were statues of lethal elegance, all unnaturally pale skin and eyes that burned with icy contempt. A wave of hostile murmurs crashed against the king as he strode to the obsidian throne, Sarah walking beside him, a frail figure in a borrowed, too large coat, clutching the infant's blanket. The vampire court shock was visceral, immortal, now visibly marked by the king's blood, standing on the royal dais. The king's platinum hair and imposing stature were the only things preventing outright chaos. Vlad took his seat. Orion nestled against his black velvet coat and raised a hand. The murmurs died instantly, replaced by a charged silence heavier than stone. "My court," Vlad's voice boomed, amplified by an inherent, ancient magic reaching every corner of the room. "You have witnessed a betrayal that cost us blood and almost cost us the future. You were deceived by traitors who preached purity but practiced fear." His icy blue gaze swept the assembly. He didn't name the traitors. Their ashes were their indictment. He then lifted Orion slightly, displaying the child's crystal crown and the cold, mystical light that emanated from him. "This is Prince Orion Wilson," he declared. "And he is afflicted. He is different. And he is guarded by a power none of you possess. We, as the keepers of the eternal night, have built our empire on strength, isolation, and unyielding tradition. But in a few moments, one mortal woman has shown us the catastrophic flaw in our foundation." He gestured to Sarah, his hand sweeping outward in a gesture that elevated her from servant to sovereign. "This is Sarah Bruce. She stood against 4 assassins. She bled to save him. Her sacrifice, her genuine, self-sacrificial human love, is the only thing that activated the ancestral protection spell within my son's core. The protective barrier rejected my power. It rejected your blood. It accepted only hers." Vlad leaned forward, the ultimate authority in the universe. "The old rules are insufficient. Purity is weakness. Fear is a relic. My son's survival is anchored to her existence, and her existence is anchored to his survival. She is the only entity that can calm him, nurture him, and keep his power balanced." He rose, the final declaration cutting through the atmosphere like a silver sword. "Therefore, by the ancient right of the crown, I bestow upon her the title of cradle-bearer of the royal line. She is granted the ultimate protectorate status. She is the official guardian of Prince Orion, now and forever. To harm the cradle-bearer is to harm the king. To challenge her is to challenge the survival of the Wilson dynasty." A wave of dissent tried to rise, but Vlad crushed it instantly with the raw force of his glare. He had fundamentally changed the core value of his kingdom in a single, terrifying decree. Compassion, embodied by a frail, formerly human waitress, had been declared necessary over centuries of aristocratic, pure-blood pride. The silence that followed was not obedience. It was shock, terror, and the dawning realization that the rules of their existence had been irrevocably shattered. Weeks bled into months within the granite walls of the king's dominion. The Gothic stone arches and vast, shadowy halls, once instruments of Vlad Wilson's terrifying isolation, now framed the slow, strange evolution of an unconventional family. Sarah Bruce, the former exhausted waitress, moved with the unnatural grace of her new immortality, her purpose clear, the care of Prince Orion. She was the still point of warmth in a universe of cold elegance. Vlad, the ancient sovereign, observed them both, often standing silently in the doorway of Orion's chamber, the platinum-haired king of night watching the delicate rituals of a human lullaby and the comfort of soft blankets. He was learning fatherhood not through battle strategies or court politics, but through silence, patience, and the fragile, unwavering love that Sarah modeled. His icy blue eyes, usually reserved for command or contempt, now held a bewildered, complicated tenderness. He had saved her life, but she was saving his soul. The constant, deep-seated fear that had defined Sarah's life had been replaced by a fierce, focused protective instinct. Her human grief was gone, replaced by a crystalline clarity, a permanent, cold calm imparted by the king's ancient blood. Yet, the memory of her grandmother and the smell of the cafe's stale coffee remained the human anchor to her new existence. One evening, while carrying Orion through the rarely used West Wing, Sarah paused. This section of the castle overlooked the famed King's Gardens, a vast, complex landscape that had been barren and frozen since the death of Vlad's queen centuries ago. It was a monument to his grief, a desolate expanse of broken stone and withered earth. But tonight, a faint, metallic sheen caught her eye. At the base of a shattered fountain, struggling through the cracked marble, was the first sign of life, a cluster of tiny, resilient silver, frost-resistant flowers. They were not the vibrant colors of the human world, but the pale, icy hue of the moon, true children of the winter night, yet undeniably alive. Sarah traced the outline of the frozen, Gothic statues that lined the walkway, noting the faint moss and lichen daring to grow on their cold surfaces. The fountain, which had stood dry for generations, now held a small, slow trickle of water. She felt a profound sense of awe. This was not the work of magic or decree. It was a consequence of compassion. Her presence, her unwavering devotion to Orion, had changed the internal landscape of the castle itself. Later that night, Vlad found her standing by the tall, diamond-paned windows overlooking the slowly awakening garden. She pointed, not needing words, toward the silver flowers. Vlad stared, his expression hardening, then softening, as he registered the impossible bloom. He was acutely aware of the change. He, the king who could command the dead and move mountains of earth, could never bring life back to this patch of ground. A frail, exhausted mortal had succeeded where millennia of ancient power had failed. He felt the cold, hard shell around his own heart crack further, exposing a deep, painful vulnerability. He looked at Sarah, truly seeing her not as the cradle-bearer, the asset, or the necessity, but as the catalyst for his own slow, reluctant rebirth. He finally articulated the monumental realization that had been building since he heard her lullaby in the cafe. "I built my empire on isolation," Vlad said, his voice quiet, devoid of its usual booming authority, "on the belief that purity, power, and fear were the only defenses against extinction. But you, Sarah, you only brought kindness. And this," he gestured toward the growing life below. "This is the result. Kindness, I realize now, is stronger than any magic I wield." This was the true moment of transformation. The king fully accepted that the path forward was not one of icy rigidity, but of warmth and risk. A few days later, the family was gathered in the main tower room. Orion, stronger now, with the glow of his crystal crown stabilized and serene, was resting on a blanket. Sarah sat nearby, mending a tear in his velvet swaddling. Vlad stood a short distance away, watching. He had always kept a physical distance, his power too vast, his fear of harming the child too great. Orion looked from Sarah to his father. The infant, disabled but no longer frail, pushed himself up onto his elbows. The action was slow, painful but determined. He wobbled, his small, icy body struggling for leverage. Then, with a grunt of effort, he pushed his hands forward, pulling his legs after him. Orion took his first unsupported steps toward his father. The king of vampires, who had witnessed empires rise and fall, who had led armies through rivers of blood, stood stunned. He did not move, did not speak. The prince toddled 3 feet across the cold stone floor, then collapsed directly into the dark embrace of his father's coat. Vlad's face was a masterpiece of raw emotion, shock, profound relief, and, for the first time in centuries, an expression that could only be described as joy. He crushed his son to his chest, the icy blue of his eyes softening to an intense sapphire. That afternoon, Vlad summoned the entire court again. They gathered in the throne room, tense and still reeling from the execution of the traitors and the elevation of Sarah. But this time, Vlad did not demand obedience. He declared an era. He strode to the obsidian throne, Orion held securely, and Sarah standing beside him, her newly immortal pallor a stark contrast to his dark elegance. "Hear me, my court." Vlad's voice boomed, but it carried an unfamiliar resonance. Less cold decree, more profound truth. We have lived in darkness, driven by the curse of separation and fear. I have maintained our isolation because I believed only purity could guarantee our survival. He held Orion up, displaying the child's thriving life. The world has changed. The threat is not from without, but from within, from the bigotry that would have seen my own son destroyed. Sarah Bruce has shown us that true strength lies not in isolation, but in the courage to accept what is different, and the will to love what is weak. Vlad rose from the throne, his eyes sweeping the assembled vampires. "We end the isolation. We end the fear. I declare this kingdom open to the path of coexistence. The old prejudices are dead, buried with the traitors who serve them. The age of eternal night is over." As he spoke the final words, a miracle occurred in the vast chamber. The narrow, stained-glass windows, which had always filtered the sun's light into weak, painful, cold blue shards, began to change. The light streaming through the glass intensified, transforming from icy blue to a soft, golden amber. The light filled the room with genuine, gentle warmth. King Vlad Wilson stepped directly into the beam, bathing his platinum hair and ancient features in the golden glow. He did not burn. He did not recoil. The curse, the centuries-old affliction that had shackled his race to the darkness, was visibly lifting, broken not by a powerful spell, but by an act of love. Sarah watched, tears streaming down her new, cold face. The distant sound of bells reached her ears, the village bells, which had been silent for generations, now chiming in celebration. She had saved the entire kingdom. "Thank you, Sarah," Vlad said, his voice quiet and heartfelt, his eyes meeting hers over Orion's head as his son reached happily for the warmth. "For everything." "Thank you," she replied, smiling for the first time in weeks. "For letting me." In the distance, the village bells continued to ring, marking the first time in living memory that humans and vampires heard the same sound of hope. The dawn of compassion had broken over the kingdom, and it would never be dark again. And that is the story of how a fragile human's simple act of kindness rescued an entire kingdom from eternal night. Sarah Bruce didn't just save a disabled baby. She healed the conflicted heart of King Vlad Wilson and ushered in a dawn of compassion. The bells are ringing, the silver gardens are blooming, and the sun shines on the king. Their journey has just begun. Thank you so much for reading. Vampire King spots human waitress carry his disabled baby vampire and changes his life forever. If this tale of forbidden love, ancient curses, and fierce, transformative kindness moved you as much as it moved King Vlad, please show your support. Like this story to help us bring more epic fantasy romances to life. Subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter or the beginning of a brand new adventure. Comment below and tell us, what do you think Vlad whispered to Sarah right before he took his first steps into the sunlight? Share this with 3 friends who love vampires, redemption, and unexpected heroes. Until the next moon rises, keep watching and keep believing in the power of love.